Welcome to The Debate. We're diving into something quite profound today. What really governs global power? It's like a hidden historical blueprint, Ray Dalio's Big Cycle framework. It's based on, 500 years of data, tracking the rise, peak, and decline of major empires, the Dutch, the British, the US. And this framework uses 18 key measures, determinants, to gauge a nation's strength.
And, what that historical pattern shows is frankly startling for the U.S. right now. We're seeing classic late cycle symptoms pretty much across the board. Things like compounding debt, really deep internal conflict, and this is critical, the fast emergence of a very sophisticated rival, China.
Right. Which brings us to, I think, the defining strategic question of our time. Given these symptoms, these undeniable signs of relative decline, where should the U.S. focus? Should it be primarily on domestic structural reform, getting our financial house in order, restoring some internal cohesion, or should we pour resources externally to guarantee technological dominance, specifically winning the AI and innovation race against China?
Look, I believe strongly that looking outward, ensuring absolute technological superiority, that's the only effective way to arrest this relative decline, especially when facing a challenger like China. Innovation isn't just about managing the cycle. It's what creates the sort of discontinuous change needed for sustained power, for creating new wealth.
And I'm going to argue for what I see as the non-negotiable foundation, domestic structural integrity. Unless we fix the underlying fiscal and political health of the nation, the entire structure of American power is, it's built on shaky ground. No amount of AI brilliance can save a country that's collapsing internally, under its own weight, its own debt. My position, it's pretty straightforward. The most immediate, potentially fatal risk, it's reversing these silent killers, the compounding debt, and frankly, the excessive money printing. If you really study the big cycle data, financial health, or the lack of it, precedes the loss of global stand almost every time. It's the basic requirement for maintaining all other kinds of power.
Okay, I absolutely acknowledge the debt problem. Nobody's ignoring that. But that financial weakness, it's a vulnerability, yes, but it only really gets exploited when a state loses its sense of purpose, its competitive edge. If the economic engine is sputtering because we've, taken our eye off the innovation ball, then just fixing the balance sheet feels, cosmetic.
That seems like a dangerous oversimplification to me. The very ability to sustain technological leadership is directly weakened by financial indiscipline. Just look at the history of the US dollar. Since we delinked paper money from gold back in '71, the government has increasingly financed its deficits by essentially running the printing press. And we saw this huge acceleration recently, didn't we? The M1 money supply had jumped from just over $4 trillion before the pandemic to over $18 trillion in a really short span. That's just not sustainable.
Okay, but explain what does that massive increase in paper money actually mean for the average person? Why is that the most urgent crisis, more urgent than falling behind technologically?
Because it means we are actively, systematically diminishing the purchasing power of every dollar. It leads to inflation, sure, but it also erodes the faith of the international investors who hold our debt. And when that debt load gets, as Dalio puts it, very large, history shows it triggers financial instability, capital flight, and eventually the loss of what's called the exorbitant privilege.
Right. Let's clarify that term, because it's really central to your point. The exorbitant privilege, that's the unique advantage the U.S. gets, because the dollar is the world's main reserve currency, right? It lets us borrow cheaply, run massive deficits.
Exactly. It means basically the rest of the world helps finance our spending. But the historical lesson is crystal clear. When fiat money creation spins out of control, that privilege disappears. And without that underlying fiscal health, those big innovation efforts you're championing, they just become financially unsustainable burdens. They could actually speed up the decline, not reverse it.
See, I approach this from, a completely different angle. The decline must be tackled by ensuring dominance in the next wave of technology. That's what creates genuine discontinuous change. It resets the whole game. Economic power, military power, just focusing on austerity or debt reduction while the competition is sprinting ahead in fields like AI. That strikes me as strategic malpractice.
But where's the definitive proof that technology is the ultimate driver, rather than just, a symptom or a high score achieved by a nation that's already fundamentally healthy and well-governed?
The evidence is right there in competitive advantage. Whoever wins the technology wars ultimately wins the economic and military wars too. I mean, China's rise isn't just about GDP numbers. It's about their aggressive challenge to American inventiveness, which is a key determinant of strength in the big cycle itself. Look at the sheer output AI patent filings, for instance. Between 2020 and 2021, China accounted for over half the world's total, 51.69%. The US, we were way behind at 16.92%. That gap, it translates directly into future economic resources. And China's GDP, measured by purchasing power parity, which is arguably the most accurate way to compare economic scale, it actually crossed the US threshold way back around 2014. Look, a static power facing a challenger this dynamic can only survive if it maintains superior technology and a clear national purpose. If we lose the tech war, internal structural reform becomes, almost irrelevant, because the core engine of modern global power will have shifted elsewhere, permanently.
Okay, let's dig into the timing of potential disaster. This is our first major point of difference, I think, the immediate threat. My position, it centers on the risk of financial contagion. History is just full of examples where international investors, they sense financial weakness and they trigger a sudden, classic decline through insolvency. And crucially, this can happen regardless of how advanced a country's tech might seem at the moment.
I have to disagree that the immediate threat is purely financial contagion. You mentioned the Dutch Empire example, the Bank of Amsterdam crisis. But that sudden insolvency, that run on the bank, it didn't happen in a vacuum, did it? It was the end result of decades of competitive overextension, the slow grinding down of their trading dominance. The financial crisis was the symptom, not the root cause in that instance.
But the mechanism of the collapse itself is sudden. It's like a structural beam in a building. Yeah, it was weakening for years, but the moment it fails, the whole structure can come crashing down almost instantly. We still hold, yes, a key advantage in the financial center score. That's true. But if global faith is lost in the currency because of unchecked debt, the debt that's compounding faster than ever, that status can evaporate incredibly quickly. It takes away our exorbitant privilege and forces a really devastating structural adjustment, potentially overnight. We need a kind of shock therapy, a realization of this frightening possibility. To force the hard choices now, we simply have to earn more than we spend.
That's a compelling case for caution, definitely. But have you really considered that innovation might be the only practical way out of the debt problem? Austerity, let's be honest, is often political suicide, and it can strangle the economy. The U.S. needs to leverage its remaining strengths, education, inventiveness, to create new wealth. I mean, if we invest strategically in advanced tech, look at AI, the global market's projected to hit over $1.3 trillion by 2030. That generates massive new revenue streams, new intellectual property. It gives us a powerful competitive edge that actually allows us to manage the debt burden much more effectively than just cutting back.
But relying on future, maybe hypothetical growth to solve a current insolvency risk feels like wishful thinking. China isn't just waiting for some big tech windfall. They're focused on, incremental, targeted growth with things like their Little Giants Innovators program, state-backed specialization. They seem to be building the foundation underneath their debt, whereas we're just adding more floors on top.
They are creating wealth to solve their problems. We need to create wealth too. If we can generate and sustain a real technological lead, our GDP grows, our tax base expands, and that debt to GDP ratio starts to look much healthier naturally. You just can't cut your way back to global leadership. You have to innovate and grow your way back.
Okay, let's pivot to the second major point, something the cycle data reveals quite starkly, the deep internal issues. Internal polarization and the erosion of national purpose. The source material really highlights how our current internal conflict, driven by the biggest wealth gaps and political divisions since around 1900, is actively preventing cohesive strategic action. That's an Absolutely essential observation, yes. The loss of internal unity, it clearly erodes the capacity for that kind of collective sacrifice that seems necessary for a great power to maintain its position. We can't even seem to agree on what the main strategic priority should be.
Precisely. And this structural polarization, it prevents the US from doing things like implementing long-term, focused industrial policy. We don't have an America 2025 blueprint that's anything like China's decades-long strategic plans. This internal strife, in my view, is actually far deeper and more immediate systemic threat than the numbers on the financial ledger, because it cripples our very ability to act on any strategy, whether it's technological or financial.
That's a powerful point about our political dysfunction, but let me try and reframe the core threat slightly. While China achieves its strategic direction through, well, autocratic cohesion, top-down control, the historical strength of the U.S. system has always been its decentralized, bottoms-up innovation engine. We haven't typically needed the state to micromanage tech breakthroughs.
But that historical strength of decentralization becomes kind of irrelevant if the system itself is paralyzed by internal warfare, doesn't it? The level of polarization we see now goes way beyond just policy disagreements. It feels like it's threatening the basic constitutional system itself.
That's exactly the danger I see. The real systemic failure isn't the lack of some specific 5-year plan, it's the existential threat to the stability of the republic. Dalio specifically warns about this when things like the non-acceptance of election outcomes or a breakdown in the rule of law due to political extremism happen, the system itself is in jeopardy. And at that point, honestly, no amount of AI patents or technological wizardry can save a constitutional order that's fracturing internally. The structural health of the republic is the absolute foundation for all other forms of power, including the power to fund or even leverage innovation effectively. We have to secure that foundation first.
So are you saying we should basically put the tech race on hold until we can somehow fix Washington, D.C.? I don't buy that the rest of the world, especially China, is going to politely pause while we try to achieve perfect political harmony. The geopolitical competition is accelerating every single day. We have to deal with the threat of competitive defeat while managing the internal chaos. We don't have the luxury of choosing one, then the other.
We have to stop the internal bleeding before we try to run a global marathon.
But maybe technological advancement is the best medicine for an ailing economy and a fractured society. Success in a major global competition, like winning the AI race, could potentially provide the very unifying national purpose that we seem to be desperately lacking right now. A strong national mission might heal internal divides far more effectively than a painful program of just cutting spending.
Okay, let's touch on a critical aspect of this modern competition, our third point, the double-edged sword nature of new technologies, particularly AI and advanced cyber capabilities. My argument here is that these new tools are inherently threatening technologies, and they maximize vulnerability precisely when a state is already fragile.
I fundamentally disagree there. I'm just not convinced by that line of reasoning because, look, technology throughout history has ultimately been an uplifting force. Let me tell you why. These advancements, they've solved enormous problems. They've led to unprecedented leaps in quality of life expectancy, GDP per capita, things the world had never seen before. Focusing only on the destructive potential really ignores the massive productivity gains and wealth generation that technology makes possible.
But for a nation burdened by massive debt and debilitating internal conflict, the downside risk is potentially catastrophic. The systemic destructive power of modern warfare is immediate. Dalio identifies 5 main types of wars, right? Trade, technology, capital, cyber, and military. A fractured internal structure with deep societal divisions is uniquely vulnerable to, say, a coordinated cyber attack that could cripple infrastructure, induce financial panic, or some other systemic shock enabled by these highly volatile technologies. We need to stabilize the system, build resilience, before we fully embrace these radical, potentially destabilizing new tools. Often the offensive capability, like cyber vulnerabilities, far outweighs the defensive capability, especially when the state itself is internally weakened.
Okay, that's a compelling argument if your priority is minimizing risk at all costs. But the true existential risk, according to many global experts, isn't the technology itself. It's the risk of an acceleration of a tit-for-tat conflict that spirals out of control because we mismanage the technological rivalry. We simply cannot afford to retreat. The U.S. has to engage fully. We need to be involved in defining the red lines, setting the global operating standards, and ensuring that the best systems, which I firmly believe are decentralized democratic ones, win out through open competition. Retreating from the technological race will only empower our rivals to define the rules of the emerging world order. We can't just be spectators in the innovation game and somehow hope to remain the dominant player.
If we circle back to the historical patterns, the big cycles of rise and decline, it seems clear that financial weakness and social fragmentation are the classic causes of inevitable decline. They're like the vital signs that deteriorate first. The U.S., I believe, still has the capacity to succeed, but only if it immediately addresses these foundational issues: spending discipline, internal cohesion. If we actually worry about these structural risks now, if we stop these silent killers, maybe we don't have to worry quite so much about whether we have the absolute best AI algorithm in 2035. That kind of success will likely follow from a stable base.
I just see it differently. The modern world order is, quite simply, defined by technological power. The U.S. cannot afford to cede the competitive edge, especially in fields like AI. All the actionable intelligence suggests that relentless innovation and strategic focus on technology are the only real ways to gain a comparative advantage and successfully navigate this intense geopolitical competition. We must generate new wealth, secure future resources, and then use that resulting strength to manage the structural issues that you, yes, correctly identify. Without maintaining that competitive edge, the decline risks becoming permanent, regardless of whether we balance the budget tomorrow.
Well, this discussion certainly highlights a critical strategic tension, doesn't it? A key insight, perhaps, that, well, maybe few policymakers are fully grasping. That real success demands this precise, ongoing, dynamic balance between maintaining internal health and driving external competition.
Absolutely. It's not an either-or, is it? We have to recognize that keeping the core system healthy across all those 18 determinants has to be managed right alongside the relentless pursuit of the next wave of innovation. They're deeply intertwined. You can't truly separate them.
The future, it seems, depends on understanding this interconnected nature of the cycles and perhaps discerning which lever, structural integrity or technological supremacy, provides the most critical, most immediate support to prevent the cycle from turning irrevocably downward.
And ultimately, we leave it to our listeners to weigh the argument, to determine which path offers the best strategic advantage for the U.S. in this clear era of imperial transition. Understanding, of course, that inaction on either front might be the surest guarantee of decline.